Hey guys, tonight we ease into forgotten medieval survival tricks, from stocking root cellars to improvising emergency shelters. You probably won't survive this if all you've got is an IKEA bookshelf. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a damp, foggy forest just outside a medieval village. The morning chill clings to your tunic, and the ground squelches beneath boots that have seen better days. You can smell smoke drifting from a nearby hearth, sweet with the lingering scent of roasted barley, and the distant clop of a cart over cobblestones. In this world, life isn't about checking Instagram notifications. It's about whether you can make it through the week without starving, freezing, or accidentally mistaking a nightshade berry for a sweet snack. Imagine the root cellar, a cool, dark pit lined with stones and packed with cabbages, turnips, and whatever tubers survived last harvest. You squat beside it, brushing dirt off a potato, and realize that in a pinch, you could survive for months just by knowing which foods last longest underground. Historians still argue whether peasants actually understood preservation scientifically or if they were just lucky with trial and error. And then there's the fringe technique, burying food wrapped in straw mixed with ash, which supposedly extended shelf life. Skeptical? Yeah, you probably should be. But back then, superstition often masqueraded as science. Shelter in this era isn't just about a roof over your head. Thatched roofs, wattle-and-daub walls, and moss-lined floors provide insulation you can feel pressing against your legs as you huddle in a corner. Some villagers even used inverted barrels or hollowed logs as micro-shelters during harsh winters, tiny, claustrophobic spaces that somehow keep the cold out. And yes, if you tried this in your backyard today, you'd likely get a call from building inspectors, but back then, ingenuity was survival. You start thinking about the essentials: fire, water, food, shelter. Without them, you're just a walking puddle of vulnerability. You probably won't survive the medieval world with only the comforts of modern life: no smartphones to Google how to boil water over a dung fire, no ready-made protein bars. But that's what makes this journey oddly comforting, imagining yourself stripped to basics. Seeing the world in textures, smells, and the quiet rhythm of daily survival, and so, with your hands pressed against cool stone and the smell of smoke curling around your nose, you step into the rhythm of medieval preparation. You notice a pile of flint stones by the wall, a bucket of rainwater in the corner, and a half-eaten loaf wrapped in cloth. Every small detail matters. Every forgotten technique, whether for storing food, starting a fire, or keeping warm, is a thread in the fabric of daily endurance. By understanding these, you're not just learning history, you're connecting to a very human, very immediate experience of survival that modern preppers often overlook. You pause and take a breath, letting the humid, earthy smell of the cellar fill your lungs. The world outside might feel distant, but here, surrounded by stones, roots, and simple ingenuity, you sense a rhythm almost meditative. You almost forget you're in the 21st century. Almost. There's a lesson already whispering: survival isn't just about tools, it's about attention, creativity, and small habits repeated until they become instinct. You probably won't replicate everything exactly, no one wants to sleep on moss, but the principles are timeless. You trace a finger along the rough-hewn wall, noticing tiny carvings and scratches, marks left by villagers long gone. Some were reminders, some doodles to break the monotony, some secret codes only insiders understood. In a way, it's comforting. The same human instincts that guided them, curiosity, ingenuity, and caution, still pulse inside you. And maybe that's the first real survival skill you can carry forward tonight: seeing the ordinary world with extraordinary attention. Root cellars, smoke trails, straw insulation, these are all lessons disguised as mundane chores. But in a moment of crisis, the mundane becomes magic, the ordinary becomes vital, you crouch low beside a modest pile of flint and steel. The edges of the metal catching the flickering amber glow of a nearby torch. Damp earth clings to the knees of your woolen trousers, and the scent of charred wood mixes with the musk of the soil, a heavy, grounding smell that seeps into your lungs with every breath. The night air carries a chill that creeps beneath your clothing, nipping at your fingers. Your hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowledge. Without fire, there is no warmth, no protection, no life. The flint is cool and slightly rough against your fingertips. You roll it once, twice, feeling its weight and edges, almost as if making a quiet pact with it. The steel is blunt and worn from repeated use. But it still holds potential, a promise waiting to be coaxed into reality. You imagine the small spark you hope to summon leaping forward, like a brief star falling into a bed of tinder. Fire in the medieval world isn't merely a luxury, it is infrastructure, a quiet, ever-present heartbeat of survival. It means light when the world is swallowed by darkness. It means heat against a winter that shows no mercy. It means a place to cook your bread, boil water, and keep sickness at bay. It means a barrier against prowling animals, raiders, or the invisible weight of night. Historians still argue about how common proper fire-starting tools were in rural households, whether most peasants owned a flint and steel kit or improvised with whatever they could find. But to anyone living here, in this place and century, the debate is meaningless. What matters is mastery. If you can't light a fire, you're at the mercy of the cold. You strike once, ting. A dull spark fizzles, landing harmlessly on the damp ground. Again. Ting. A brighter flicker this time, short-lived but promising. Then a third strike. A fragile orange spark leaps forward and kisses the dry tinder nestled carefully in a shallow hollow you carved out earlier. It hisses faintly, like a secret being whispered between the stones. This is the common way, flint and steel, carbon striking stone, a spark caught by charred cloth or dry grass. But you know there are stranger, cleverer methods as well. Some involve dried cow or horse dung, mixed with bits of straw and pressed into rough bricks, dung briquettes. It sounds absurd, laughable even, but once they catch, they burn slowly and steadily, radiating an even, enduring heat. The smell is thick and earthy, more potent than wood smoke, sometimes acrid, but to a medieval villager with limited timber, it's not disgusting. It's pragmatic. Whether this method was widespread or reserved for a few resourceful households is still debated by historians. Monasteries, with their meticulous records, might have documented it first. But many suspect it was simply the quiet ingenuity of peasants, knowledge passed not through parchment and ink, but from rough, work-worn hands to small, curious ones. No one boasts about dung fires, they simply work. You kneel deeper into the earth, ignoring the skeptical look a neighbor once gave you for gathering dung like a squirrel hoarding nuts. You strike again, feed the spark with patience, not force. It's a rhythm that feels older than language. Strike, wait, blow gently, watch it grow. There's a stillness to it, almost meditative. In this moment, the world shrinks down to a single glowing ember and your breath coaxing it to life. Modern preppers and adventurers, with their boxes of matches and gas lighters, often overlook the quiet discipline of this act. Flint teaches patience. It teaches you to listen, to the crackle of tinder, to the direction of the breeze, to the faint change in color as the ember deepens from orange to gold. Your wrists ache slightly with each strike, but it's a familiar ache, one that binds you to countless others across centuries who made fire in just this way. You glance up and notice how the smoke begins to curl, drifting toward the east. It's not just a quirk of air. In the medieval world, smoke direction is a signal. It tells you where the wind comes from, how fast it moves, whether your fire will catch or be snuffed out. The villagers once used such smoke to communicate across the fields, sending thin, twisting trails upward as signals, warnings of raiders, calls for help, or even invitations to communal feasts. It's not a romantic fantasy, it's practical, efficient, and born of necessity. You cup your hands around the ember and blow, slow and steady, your breath joining with the ancient rhythm of survival. A faint flame blossoms. Shy at first, then steadier. Heat warms your face, faint but unmistakable. You feed it with slivers of kindling, hearing the faint crackle as it takes hold, and then comes the unexpected part, the psychological shift. With the flame alive, something inside your chest loosens. Fear retreats to the edges of your awareness. The flickering light doesn't just warm your skin, it anchors you. It carves out a little circle of safety in a world that can be brutally indifferent. You imagine long winter nights, wolves howling in the distance, storms clawing at the shutters, and how a single fire like this can make the difference between despair and endurance. Dung briquettes may smell strange, flint strikes may bruise your hand, and smoke may sting your eyes. But this humble ritual trains more than your fingers. It sharpens your patience, your observation, your ability to move at the world's pace rather than forcing it to move at yours. Fire is not only heat. It is presence. It is memory. It is quiet resilience, and as the flame steadies, as the smoke rises in smooth, patient tendrils, you understand why so many medieval lives were built around this simple act, because sometimes survival is born from nothing more than spark, patience, and breath. You kneel by a muddy stream, the hem of your clothing darkening as it soaks up the damp earth beneath you. The stream runs narrow but fast, curling around stones polished smooth by centuries of flow. You stretch your hand toward the water, and as your fingers break through the thin film of surface tension, a sharp chill rushes up your wrist. The cold bites, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind you that water here isn't always your friend. You cup it in your palms, watching the way sunlight fractures into shifting silver lines on the surface, and for a fleeting second, it looks deceptively clean. But you know better. Clean water isn't a guarantee. It never is. Not here. Not now. A single careless sip from the wrong pool can unravel your health within hours. Dysentery, fevers, cramps, quiet killers, born from water that seemed clear. Medieval villagers knew this instinctively, even if they lacked the language of microbes and pathogens. Their knowledge was practical, shaped by loss and observation, by the grim arithmetic of what worked and what didn't. Historians still debate whether water purification methods in villages were organized customs or improvised tricks, but to people living here, survival was not an academic question. It was a daily, unglamorous practice. You picture one of the most common tools, a clay filter, shaped by rough hands from local riverbed mud. It's molded into a porous cone, then baked until hard, primitive, yes, but durable. Inside, villagers layer fine sand, crushed charcoal, and sometimes fragments of broken shells or stones. When water trickles through it, the sediment is caught in the layers. The process is slow, drop by drop, like listening to time itself pass. It doesn't make the water taste sweet or smell perfect. But it removes enough to keep illness at bay. It's not technology in the modern sense, it's patient ingenuity. Then there's the fringe habit, a splash of vinegar or a pinch of powdered herbs like rue, hyssop, or wormwood added to the filtered water. To a medieval mind, these herbs helped balance humors and fight miasmas. To modern science, some of those same herbs contain mild antimicrobial properties. The villagers didn't know why it worked, they just knew enough people survived to keep doing it. You imagine the taste of such water on your tongue, sharp, faintly bitter, earthy with a hint of sourness. Not pleasant, but alive. Boiling water is another safeguard. But it's not as simple as striking a match and waiting. It means striking flint, nursing a small flame, feeding it dung briquettes or scrap wood, setting up a heavy iron or clay cauldron, and waiting for the slow roll of bubbles. Fuel is scarce, every spark matters. The fire hisses as moisture in the wood boils away. Steam rises, curling upward in soft, ghostly ribbons. The bubbling of the cauldron is both a comfort and a strain. It means safety is near, but it also costs precious time and resources. You realize, every drop of safe water has a price, paid in patience, in labor, in fuel. Villagers learn to read water the way a shepherd reads his flock. A slight greenish tint, a ring of foam hugging the bank, the faint musk of stagnation, these are warnings. Water from fast-flowing streams, though still risky, is safer than the sluggish pools where insects lay eggs and algae blooms unseen. And so, they learn to choose. To be cautious. To survive, but water is not only for drinking. It is a servant to 100 daily tasks. It's used to soak grains, wash roots and vegetables, brew thin ale, scrub grime from skin, put out fires, or coax wool into pliable softness. A medieval household without water mastery is like a hearth without flame, functionally lifeless. And so, they invent ways to stretch its usefulness. One of those forgotten tricks is to store it in unglazed clay jars buried halfway underground. The porous walls sweat moisture, cooling the liquid inside, a quiet, clever form of refrigeration long before icehouses existed. You dip your fingers deeper into the stream, feeling the icy flow swirl around your knuckles. It numbs you, but there's something calming in its rhythm. Filtering and boiling water isn't glamorous work, but it centers you, forces your attention to the small things, the grit between your fingers, the changing temperature as the sun shifts overhead, the faint sound of distant birds over the rush of water. Every movement is deliberate. Every action measured. You can't rush clean water. If you do, the river punishes carelessness with sickness. There are whispers, too, about vinegar. Some households save the dregs from their vinegar barrels, not for cooking, but for preservation. A few spoonfuls swirled into storage barrels are said to keep the water lively and fresh for weeks. Whether this is folk magic or accidental chemistry, it works more often than not. The acidic tang slows the growth of invisible rot. It's a ritual as much as a technique, a few drops of sourness standing between health and fever. As you rise from the stream, your palms dripping, your sleeves damp and streaked with mud, you feel the weight of what you've learned without a word being spoken. Survival here doesn't shout, it whispers in the way water cools in clay, in the smell of boiled stream water, in the patience of waiting for a trickle through charcoal. It's built from habits repeated countless times, from wisdom carried in hands rather than books. You probably won't survive long if you ignore these steps. But if you pay attention, truly listen to the water, you align yourself with a rhythm older than any written rule. The stream flows on, relentless and indifferent. It will not care if you thrive or fail. It is your observation, your small acts of patience, that turn a cold, muddy stream into the difference between life and death. And that lesson lingers in your damp sleeves, your chilled hands, and the quiet awareness in your chest. You venture into the edge of a dense, brambly thicket, where the air grows cooler and damper beneath the canopy. Leaves brush and scratch lightly against your bare arms, leaving faint, stinging lines in their wake. Twigs snap and crackle under your boots, a sharp contrast to the soft rustle of shifting foliage above. The scent of humus, the deep, earthy perfume of rotting leaves and wet soil, seeps into your nose with every breath. Foraging isn't a leisurely pastime here. It's an unspoken pact with the land. If you don't know where to look, if you don't know how to read the forest's quiet language, you won't eat. You probably won't survive if you rely only on what the Lord's tithe leaves behind or the meager grains locked away in the village stores. The forest is both pantry and puzzle, its bounty hidden behind layers of observation and patience. Medieval peasants grew up in tune with this rhythm, learning without parchment or ink, guided instead by stories whispered around hearths and the silent pointing fingers of elders showing which plants nourish and which kill. Historians still argue over what counted as staple forage versus seasonal luxuries, but to the people living it, those categories blurred. It was all about survival, not classification. You crouch low beside a patch of hazel bushes, their arching branches heavy with clusters of green leaves curled protectively around ripe nuts. When you brush them aside, the hard shells are cool beneath your fingers, smooth with a faintly dusty texture. Hazelnuts are an early autumn treasure. Dense with fat and energy, light enough to carry, and one of the few wild foods that can last through winter if stored properly. You imagine the rhythm of shelling them by a fire, fingers aching but the air filled with the soft crack of splitting shells. Nearby, chestnuts nestle in spiky burrs, their shells prickly like warning signs. Acorns scatter across the forest floor in messy abundance, but their usefulness is less straightforward. Raw, they're bitter and unkind to the stomach, but after careful leaching in cold, running water, sometimes for days, they transform into an earthy, starchy food. That's the thing about foraging here, nothing is truly free. Every edible prize comes with hidden work. A price measured in time, patience, and a good memory for what can and can't be done. Then there's the curious little ritual you've seen before, small pouches of powdered chalk or ash sprinkled lightly on wild herbs. It's said to enhance growth or keep away mischievous forest spirits. You can't help but smirk a little. It's not science, not in the way you define it today, but it's a way of building a relationship with the landscape, a ritual that blends superstition and practical habit into something enduring. Mushrooms demand even more respect. You tread carefully near a patch of damp, shadowy earth where tiny caps push through like secrets. Every villager knows that a wrong mushroom can stop a heart before sunrise. The safest way is knowledge passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, color, gills, smell, the places they grow. Some are harmless but useless, others life-saving during a lean winter. A few are outright deadly. There's a grim kind of folklore here, stories of families struck down because someone mistook one white cap for another. It's caution written in grief, repeated often enough that it becomes rule. A strange belief circles around fairy rings, those perfect circles of mushrooms that sometimes appear overnight. Some villagers swear they can predict the weather or foretell an invasion, others insist stepping into one brings bad luck. Scholars debate whether these beliefs mask practical warnings, like the way certain fungi thrive in particular soil conditions, but you can't help but feel a shiver when your boot hesitates at the edge of a perfect ring. The forest is alive, and not always friendly. Berries offer easier comfort. Elderberries droop in inky clusters, blackberries twine along thorny vines, and wild raspberries gleam like garnet in the sunlight filtering through the leaves. Their tart sweetness is a gift, but even here there's a rhythm to respect. Unripe berries can sour your stomach. And too many at once can leave you weak. You pluck them carefully, brushing away the tiny ants and beetles that cling to their soft skins, and when the first burst of juice floods your tongue, it's almost shockingly alive, a vivid sweetness against the earthy musk of the woods. Foraging has its tricks, too. You recall old tales of bee nets, where villagers would coax bees toward hollowed gourds or clay pots baited with bits of wax or honeycomb. It's a risky task, often done in twilight when bees are sluggish, but the reward is liquid gold, honey that sweetens meals, seals wounds, and preserves fruit. Historians debate whether this was common practice or the work of daring few, but you can almost feel the sticky weight of honey on your fingers as you imagine it. The forest is not a quiet pantry, it speaks constantly. The soft squelch beneath your boots warns of a hidden spring. A sudden flutter in the canopy above might mean a bird startled by your presence, or a predator startled by theirs. Even the scent of crushed ferns or broken bark tells you who or what passed through here before. Foraging is as much about listening as it is about picking. You pause on a moss-covered log, your palms stained faintly green from crushed leaves, a handful of berries cooling in your hand. In this stillness, surrounded by damp earth and filtered sunlight, the lesson settles in. Medieval foraging wasn't about abundance, it was about intimacy with the land, pattern recognition, trust in old wisdom, and a keen awareness that one wrong step could cost more than a meal. Superstition blends seamlessly with practical skill, and in that blend lies the art of survival. You probably won't survive if you ignore these principles. But if you listen to the whispers of the forest, if you let your senses guide you, you can thrive here, not comfortably, but quietly, skillfully, deliberately. The thicket may scratch and sting, but it also feeds, and in its tangled heart, you feel the pulse of a world where survival is both a science and a story. You creep through the underbrush, careful not to snap a single twig underfoot. The air is cool and damp, heavy with the earthy scent of soil and leaves in decay. Your breathing slows as you strain your ears for the faintest rustle, a soft shift of fur, the flutter of wings, the whisper of movement that might reveal prey. In this world, hunting isn't a sport with bright livery and polished spears, it's survival measured out in heartbeats and silence. You probably won't last long if you think you can rely solely on the village's thinly rationed hunting rights or some rusty, borrowed spear. For most medieval peasants, hunting wasn't a grand chase. It was a quiet, dangerous, and often illegal act of necessity. Traps, snares, pits, nets, became both tools of survival and small acts of rebellion against the boundaries of lordly control. Historians still argue whether common folk ever truly had legal permission to hunt on the Lord's lands, or whether most of these expeditions were done beneath the cover of darkness, with the forest as both accomplice and witness. Punishments for poaching could be harsh, but hunger was a far more relentless master. You crouch lower now, the dampness of the earth seeping into your knees, and your fingers brush against a length of twisted cord carefully hidden among roots and fallen leaves. A rabbit snare. Simple, elegant, deadly. Its design is so subtle that an untrained eye would never notice it, a loop of cord, tensioned just enough to tighten at the precise moment a rabbit hops through. One wrong placement, one poorly set knot, and the trap fails. But set well, it works without you lifting a hand. It's a quiet collaboration between human cunning and animal routine. There's something almost meditative about this rhythm. You set the snare, step back, and let the forest continue its endless choreography. The trees sway. Birds call. A faint breeze stirs the undergrowth. Somewhere, in its ordinary path, an animal will come. Then there's the quirky twist that always sticks in your mind, honey-coated sticks. Some medieval hunters, too poor to waste bait on larger game, smeared sticks with honey to lure insects. Birds, drawn by the swarm, followed. The whole process feels absurdly clever, a food chain manipulated by patience and sweet sap. Further along, a depression in the ground catches your eye, a pit trap. Dug deep into the soil, hidden beneath a delicate lattice of twigs and camouflaged with leaves, it waits silently. Some traps were simple, meant to hold the animal alive, others were cruel, fitted with sharpened stakes. You imagine the work behind it, hauling dirt away in baskets, arranging branches so lightly they don't break under a passing breeze but collapse beneath the weight of a deer. Historians still debate how widespread these traps were. Were they desperate measures taken during lean winters or steady, well-practiced techniques embedded into rural survival? Either way, they tell the same story: survival required more strategy than brute strength. To outwit prey, you needed to know the forest as intimately as you knew your own hearth. When you lift your head, the forest around you is no longer just trees and shadows, it's a living map. Rabbits dart between bracken. Birds flit from branch to branch, their wings whispering like soft parchment. Somewhere to the left, the quiet snap of a twig betrays a fox's passing. Hunting, here, isn't just catching. It's reading. Every dropping, every faint track pressed into damp earth, every feather or tuft of fur clinging to a bramble is a message. If you ignore these clues, your belly stays empty. If you learn their language, the forest might feed you. Then there's a fringe method that almost makes you laugh aloud: straw and clay decoys. Peasants sometimes shaped crude rabbits or birds from whatever they had, straw, mud, scraps of cloth, and placed them near traps to draw in predators. Whether it worked well or not is still up for debate. Scholars argue over whether this was a widespread hunting trick or just a handful of clever experiments lost to time. But in your mind's eye, you can see it: a farmer crouched at twilight, fashioning a lumpy little clay rabbit, placing it with care near a snare, then stepping back into the brush to wait. Patience, hope, and perhaps a bit of superstition mingling in the fading light, you lean back against a moss-covered tree trunk, the bark cool and rough against your back. Your fingers trace the curve of the snare, and you feel how alive the world around you is. Modern parks can't replicate this raw tension, the alert stillness, the sense that every rustle matters. Every sound is a piece of information. Every movement, a possibility. In this place, hunting isn't about sport or spectacle. It's about patience stretched thin like wire, about timing sharpened to a single breath. You probably won't survive if you rush. You probably won't survive if you ignore the language the forest is speaking. And you certainly won't survive if you underestimate the intelligence of your prey, or the watchful eyes of your neighbors, but if you lean into the forest's rhythm, listening closely, moving deliberately, respecting the unseen choreography of creatures and traps, something remarkable happens. Survival becomes a skillful dance. The tension doesn't fade, it steadies. And as you breathe in the cool, loamy air, surrounded by the ancient pulse of the woods, that quiet, dangerous dance feels, just for a moment, exhilarating. You sit beside a sturdy wooden table in a dimly lit kitchen, the only illumination coming from a single tallow candle that flickers softly, casting long, uneven shadows across the room. The air is thick and layered, smoky with the scent of curing meat, tangy with the sharp bite of fermenting vegetables, and warm with the earthy undertone of root cellars beneath the floorboards. Preserving food in the medieval world isn't a matter of luxury or culinary exploration, it is the lifeline that determines whether a family survives through winter. You probably won't last long if you rely only on fresh produce or milk that sours in a day. Preservation is less a skill here and more a daily ritual, an unspoken rhythm woven into the fabric of life. Salt reigns as the undisputed king of the kitchen. A small sack of it, precious and gritty between your fingers, represents security, bargaining power, even wealth. You sprinkle coarse grains over a thick slab of pork, pressing firmly until the crystals grind into the flesh. The action feels deliberate and almost ceremonial. The salt draws out moisture, slows decay, and keeps invisible enemies, bacteria, at bay. But it's not as easy as it looks. Too little salt, and rot will set in before the month is out. Too much, and the meat hardens into something nearly inedible, good only for boiling into stews to soften its briny toughness. You can almost hear the dry scrape of salt against meat. The faint creak of the wooden table beneath your elbows as you work, the smokehouse, or sometimes just a corner of the hearth, comes next. Meat and fish are strung up on wooden racks above a carefully tended fire, the embers kept at a low, steady smolder. The smoke curls and twists upward, wrapping itself around hanging sausages and salted haunches, carrying with it the scent of pine, oak, and occasionally dried herbs thrown in for flavor. The slow infusion of smoke not only seasons but protects, keeping flies and mold away. You imagine tending this fire at odd hours, feeding it small bundles of bark and kindling, making sure the smoke never dies out. It's not just cooking, it's vigilance. Then there's the stranger, less appetizing trick, the one that makes you wrinkle your nose. Some medieval households stored meat in fermented whey, the tangy, acidic byproduct of cheesemaking. The idea seems bizarre to modern sensibilities, but that mildly acidic environment slowed spoilage effectively when salt was too costly or scarce. You picture a heavy clay crock filled with pale, cloudy liquid and a joint of meat submerged within, faint bubbles forming around it over time. It's an improvisation born of necessity rather than preference, and though historians still debate how widespread the practice was, it speaks volumes about the ingenuity of those who refused to waste a single resource. Pickling vegetables, by contrast, feels almost elegant. You crush herbs in a mortar, their oils releasing sharp, bright scents that cut through the smoky air. Vinegar glugs into the ceramic jar, mingling with the earthy fragrance of carrots, cabbage, or onions. Layer by layer, the vegetables are submerged, transformed into something that will last not just weeks but entire seasons. It's not just sustenance, its preservation of brightness itself, a promise of something crisp and flavorful in the dead of winter. Some families even add ashes or powdered roots, believing these little touches give the pickles strength, longevity, or a charm against spoilage. Whether science or superstition, the practice endures. Storage, too, is a craft of its own. The kitchen connects to a cool root cellar below, a place of perpetual twilight where air stays damp and steady. Earthen jars are buried or stacked in shadowed corners, their rough clay surfaces cool against your palm. These jars breathe slowly through their porous walls, keeping vegetables fresh longer, allowing fermentation to unfold at its own deliberate pace. Shelves carved into stone walls hold smoked meats wrapped in linen, the faint salt smell mingling with soil and wood. In a world without refrigeration, architecture and placement themselves become tools of survival. The process is slow, methodical, and tactile. Every sound matters, the crackle of the fire, the faint hiss as vinegar hits vegetables, the crunch of salt under your nails. Every smell carries meaning. A sour note where there should be sharp vinegar. Something's gone wrong. A faint green bloom on salted meat. It's been left too long unattended. Preservation demands a constant awareness of your environment. You probably won't survive if you treat it lightly. Spoiled food here isn't just unpleasant, it can sicken or kill. By the time you lean back against the rough plaster wall, the kitchen has taken on a quiet rhythm of its own. Smoke drifts in delicate ribbons toward the rafters. The jars on the shelves glimmer faintly in the dim light, their contents sealed away like small victories. Every method, salting, smoking, pickling, fermenting, tells a story of patience and necessity. This isn't just food preparation, it's a daily negotiation with time and nature, a way of stretching the bounty of one season into the harshness of the next. The kitchen, in its quiet hum of preservation, isn't just a place to cook. It's a workshop, a laboratory, a battlefield fought meal by meal against rot and scarcity. And in this space, surrounded by the mingled scents of salt and smoke, vinegar and earth, you begin to understand that survival is less about abundance and more about attention, steady hands, patient hearts, and a respect for every fragile resource that stands between hunger and the cold. You duck under a low-hanging beam in a small thatched cottage, brushing dust from your sleeves as you survey the interior. Shelter in the medieval era wasn't about style or comfort, it was a finely tuned system of survival. You probably won't survive if you underestimate its importance. Thatched roofs, wattle and daub walls, and moss insulation all work together to keep warmth in and cold out. Historians still argue whether such techniques were standardized or varied wildly by region and availability of materials. The thatch overhead, bundled reeds tightly woven, smells faintly of hay and smoke. You imagine rain pounding on it, yet the water trickles harmlessly down the sloped roof, absorbed and diverted efficiently. Below, walls made from woven wooden strips coated in mud, wattle and daub, provide structural support and insulation. You press your hand against the wall and feel the subtle give, the cool dampness of earth, a tactile reminder of centuries-old engineering. It's primitive, yes, but astonishingly effective for its purpose. Then there's the fringe technique, moss insulation. Villagers stuffed moss into walls, ceilings, or even under floors, creating soft, warm padding. It was inexpensive, abundant, and surprisingly efficient. Some even used moss as makeshift bedding material, layering it beneath straw mattresses to trap heat. Historians still debate whether moss was primarily for insulation, comfort, or both, but there's a quiet genius in using what nature provides. The interior layout matters too. Smoke from the hearth rises slowly through the room, warming stones and walls, circulating heat while cooking meals. You notice the clever positioning of beds and workspaces, nearer the hearth in winter, further away in summer. Small openings for light and ventilation, combined with thick walls, create a microclimate. You probably won't survive if you think shelter is just a roof. It's a system, an interplay of materials, airflow, and heat. There's also the amusing aspect of medieval ingenuity. inverted barrels or hollowed logs sometimes served as temporary shelters or storage. You picture a villager curling up inside a barrel, a tiny cocoon in the middle of a snowstorm. It seems ridiculous. Almost comical, but it works. Fringe or not, these methods reflect adaptability and creative problem-solving under pressure. You sit on a straw-covered bench, feeling the soft moss beneath your fingers, and realize shelter isn't passive. It requires maintenance, observation, and adjustments according to weather and season. Modern preppers may focus on tents and emergency shelters, but medieval homes teach a lesson in layered protection, multiple techniques working together, low-tech yet incredibly effective. You probably won't survive if you ignore these details, but if you learn to read materials and understand their behavior, you gain a rhythm and reassurance that only comes from truly inhabiting your space. By the time you lean back and listen to the soft creak of the timbers, you sense the quiet pulse of medieval life, every design choice intentional, every material serving multiple purposes. Shelter is more than survival, it's a tactile, sensory, and strategic exercise. And you realize that, even without electricity or modern insulation, medieval ingenuity created a home that could weather storms, cold nights, and scarcity with surprising resilience. You step carefully across a stone floor, feeling the uneven bumps beneath your feet, and notice the faint smell of herbs lingering in the air. Hygiene in the medieval world was complicated. You probably won't survive thinking a quick splash of water is enough. Bathhouses were rare, and daily washing was minimal for most peasants, but forgotten hygiene hacks filled the gap, from herbal washes to surprising protective pastes. Historians still debate whether these measures were effective or mostly ritualistic, but there's no denying their prevalence. You peek into a small basin where water has been infused with rosemary, lavender, and rue. Villagers would dip cloths or themselves into the aromatic brew, scrubbing dirt from hands, face, and even hair. Some believe that the herbs warded off disease, bad spirits, or unpleasant smells. Fringe but fascinating, certain texts mention using crocodile dung as sunscreen, supposedly to protect the skin from sunburn during fieldwork. You grimace slightly, imagining the texture, yet you have to admire the medieval willingness to experiment with anything at hand. Scholars still argue if dung was widely used or just a handful of eccentric attempts recorded in obscure manuscripts. Soap existed but was not universally available. Instead, people relied on sand, ashes, and abrasive cloths to clean themselves. You trace a finger along a coarse, gray powder left in a basin. It's gritty, effective, and surprisingly practical. Modern preppers might scoff, but these techniques show ingenuity and resourcefulness. You probably won't survive if you assume cleanliness is a modern luxury. Dirt, sweat, and oils were managed carefully, just in unconventional ways. Hair and lice were another battlefield. Combs made of bone, frequent inspections, and small doses of herbs or vinegar kept infestations somewhat under control. The fringe aspect here: some peasants reportedly rubbed nettle leaves on their scalps to repel lice. It probably stung, but it was considered worth the discomfort. Historians still debate the effectiveness versus the ritualistic or placebo value of these remedies, but you can't argue with persistence. Toilet habits were equally inventive. Chamber pots were common indoors, but outdoors, people dug simple latrines or relied on natural cover. You probably won't survive if you ignore the social ingenuity involved. Strategically placed waste pits, composting techniques, and even rudimentary sewer channels in wealthier towns all reflect a careful attention to sanitation that's easy to underestimate. You pause by a small fire where water heats for the herbal bath, inhaling the fragrant steam. Hygiene was about more than cleanliness, it was comfort, prevention, and psychological reassurance. Rituals, herbs, and experimentation all combined to keep medieval life tolerable. You probably won't survive if you dismiss these practices, but leaning into them, you begin to understand a rhythm: cautious, attentive, and creatively adaptive. Every wash, every scrub, every bizarre sun-protective paste represents survival in a world without convenience. You start to see that hygiene wasn't about vanity, it was about practicality, health, and the subtle art of living well enough to face each day. You wrap your fingers around a thick, coarse woolen tunic, feeling the slight itch against your skin. Clothing in the medieval era wasn't fashion, it was survival. You probably won't survive if you underestimate its importance against cold, rain, or biting winds. Villagers relied on layers, wool for warmth, linen for breathability, and sturdy leather for protection. Historians still debate how much layering was customary versus reserved for the wealthy, but the principle is universal. Warmth and mobility were crucial. You tug on an underlayer of linen and notice the softness against your forearm, then a heavier woolen tunic over it. Each layer traps air, insulates, and allows you to shed or add as conditions change. Fringe techniques included stuffing tunics with straw or moss to create extra insulation during harsh winters. You probably think it sounds ridiculous today, but it worked surprisingly well, especially when combined with a close-fitting hood and woolen stockings. Leather boots were another essential. Villagers sometimes treated leather with urine, a practice that seems absurd until you learn it made the hide more water-resistant. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or limited to small regions, but it's one of those details that highlight medieval ingenuity. You press your hand against the softened, darkened leather, imagining trudging through frost and mud with feet warm and dry. You probably won't survive if you assume a single layer of clothing is enough in a world where wind, rain, and snow can strike suddenly. Outer garments often included cloaks or capes, sometimes fastened with wooden or metal brooches. They served multiple purposes: warmth, camouflage, and even makeshift blankets for the night. Fringe accessories included padded sleeves stuffed with straw, designed to double as emergency armor or padding against falls. You can almost see a peasant juggling chores, child, and sheep, relying on every fold of fabric to survive the day. You notice the subtle signs of wear: patched elbows, reinforced knees, fraying cuffs. Each repair is a lesson in resourcefulness and thrift. You probably won't survive if you disregard the importance of maintaining clothing. One tear in wet weather could lead to hypothermia or illness. It's tactile learning, knowing where reinforcements are needed, how to layer effectively, and how to improvise when materials are scarce. Even dyes serve survival purposes. Dark colors hid stains and wear. Certain plant-based dyes were thought to repel insects or strengthen fibers. You brush your fingers over a tunic dyed with woad, feeling its slightly rough texture. Medieval clothing is more than fabric, it's a system of protection, insulation, and utility. Every stitch, patch, and layer represents knowledge passed down through generations, a quiet testament to human creativity in the face of necessity. By the time you adjust your tunic and wrap your cloak tighter, you understand, survival is sewn into the very fibers of life. You probably won't last long if you ignore these lessons, but if you respect clothing as both shield and tool, you gain comfort, safety, and a subtle confidence against the unpredictable world outside. You grip a stout wooden staff, its surface smoothed by countless hands, and glance around the edge of the village. Defense in the medieval world didn't mean firearms, it meant ingenuity, alertness, and a little improvisation. You probably won't survive if you rely solely on muscle or courage. Peasants and villagers crafted booby traps, sharpened stakes, and clever decoys to protect themselves from marauders, wolves, or the occasional overzealous noble. Historians still argue whether these defensive measures were widespread or localized to particularly lawless regions. You spot a simple tripwire tied between two trees, almost invisible against the underbrush. It's a classic early warning system. Step on it, and a small bell or tin rattles, signaling intruders or predators. Then there's the quirky tactic of scarecrow dummies, dressed in ragged clothing with painted faces, designed to startle both humans and animals alike. You probably think it's silly, but imagine a thief or a wolf pausing uncertainly at the sight of a standing villager in the fog. Fringe or not, sometimes the simplest tricks worked best. Sharp stakes embedded in the ground around granaries or along paths were another deterrent. You notice the clever angling, high enough to impede movement but low enough not to catch the villagers themselves. Historians still debate whether these were primarily defensive or also served to mark boundaries, but either way, they demanded foresight, planning, and an understanding of human and animal behavior. Every defensive measure required observation. You imagine scanning the tree line, listening for the faintest rustle, predicting movement patterns, and adapting traps accordingly. Hunting and defense often overlapped. A snare for rabbits could double as a tripwire for small predators. You probably won't survive if you ignore the multi-purpose logic of medieval ingenuity. There's also the psychological element. A simple noise, a false shadow, or a cleverly placed dummy could deter intruders without a single blow. Villagers understood that perception is half the battle. Sometimes, making a place seem well defended is more effective than actual weaponry. Fringe practices, like tying rags soaked in garlic to doors or hanging effigies of saints, were part superstition, part early psychological warfare. Scholars still debate the practical versus ritualistic value, but the creativity is undeniable. You run a hand along the staff and imagine walking the perimeter at dusk, feeling the soft crunch of leaves and the tense anticipation of movement in shadows. Defense in the medieval world is sensory, strategic, and constant. You probably won't survive if you underestimate it, but if you adopt the mindset, layering observation, psychological cues, and simple traps, you gain a rhythm and confidence that no sword or modern alarm could replicate. It's less about fighting than about thinking ahead, noticing patterns, and turning every small advantage into survival. You step out into the open fields as dusk begins to settle, the horizon painted in muted purples and golds. Navigation in the medieval world wasn't about GPS or Google Maps. You probably won't survive long if you can't read your surroundings. Villagers and travelers relied on stars, moss, rivers, and landmarks to find their way. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers truly used celestial navigation or if that skill was mostly reserved for sailors and monks, but the principle remains: careful observation mattered more than luck. You glance at the sky, noting the position of the North Star just beginning to pierce twilight. A well-trained villager could orient themselves even in unfamiliar terrain. Then there's the quirky tactic of moss observation. Moss tends to grow on the north side of trees in the northern hemisphere, providing a subtle, yet surprisingly consistent, compass. Fringe but fascinating, some guides even recommended counting tree rings to estimate terrain elevation and moisture content for travel planning. Scholars still debate the reliability of moss and rings as true navigational tools, but in a pinch, they offered valuable clues. Rivers were natural highways. You probably won't survive long if you ignore them. Following the flow downstream often led to settlements, mills, or foraging grounds. Streams also served as markers. A bend in a river could indicate proximity to certain forests or farmlands. Observing water clarity, speed, and wildlife activity gave travelers additional orientation cues. Medieval guides sometimes used stone cairns or carved notches on trees to mark safe paths, combining natural and human-made indicators. Night navigation required acute sensory awareness. The sounds of distant owls, the rustling of leaves, and even changes in air temperature could hint at hidden obstacles, water bodies, or enemy encampments. Fringe techniques included listening for echoes in valleys or using wind shifts to predict weather changes. Historians still argue whether ordinary villagers actively used such methods or if they were the domain of hunters and scouts. But the knowledge existed in pockets, passed down orally from generation to generation. You kneel by a riverbank, letting your fingers skim the water, and realize navigation wasn't just a physical task, it was mental mapping, observation, and prediction. You probably won't survive if you wander blindly, but by reading stars, moss, rivers, and terrain patterns, you engage in a subtle, meditative dialogue with the land. Modern preppers often emphasize gadgets, yet medieval methods teach patience, intuition, and heightened awareness. Each step is deliberate, each glance at the sky or the water a silent calculation. You're not just moving, you're understanding the environment, by the time you rise and continue along the river. You appreciate the layered intelligence behind medieval navigation. It's a combination of science, observation, and folk wisdom, all aimed at survival. You probably won't survive without these skills, but embracing them awakens a rhythm of attentiveness and resourcefulness that modern tools can never fully replicate. Each step, each observation, each tiny detail becomes a lifeline, a reminder that the world can guide you, if only you learn to listen. You settle onto a mossy log at the forest's edge, inhaling the earthy scent of damp soil and fallen leaves. Pain, cuts, and illness are ever-present threats in the medieval world. You probably won't survive if you ignore remedies. Folk medicine combined practical observation with superstition, using poultices, honey, willow bark, and occasionally bizarre treatments like leech poultices. Historians still argue whether these remedies were primarily effective or more symbolic, but they formed the backbone of survival for villagers with limited access to physicians. You crush fresh willow bark between your fingers, feeling its fibrous texture. Willow contains salicin, a natural precursor to modern aspirin, used to reduce pain and fever. You probably think it's primitive, but in a world without pharmacies, this simple bark could mean the difference between functioning and succumbing to illness. Poultices of crushed herbs mixed with animal fat or honey were applied to wounds, reducing infection risk and promoting healing. Fringe methods, like leech poultices, seem grim but were intended to rebalance bodily humors. Scholars still debate whether these practices were physiologically effective or merely placebo, but peasants relied on them nonetheless. Honey was both medicine and preservative. You smear a small dab over a scraped knee, imagining its antibacterial properties sealing the wound. Vinegar, onion, and garlic were also common treatments, sometimes to cleanse, sometimes to repel perceived evil spirits. Some remedies even involved ritualistic chants or prayers, blending psychological reassurance with tangible care. You probably won't survive if you dismiss the mental component. Confidence in a remedy often enhanced its perceived effectiveness. You notice small bundles of dried herbs hanging from beams: chamomile, yarrow, mint. These weren't decorative, they were medicine at hand. A poultice for burns, a tea for digestion, or a crushed leaf for headaches. The fringe tidbit: some villagers applied crushed snail slime to wounds, claiming accelerated healing. Scholars still argue whether such practices had genuine efficacy or were purely superstition, but they reveal a willingness to experiment and adapt with what the environment provided. Pain management extended beyond remedies. You observe how villagers adjusted posture, used splints fashioned from wood, and applied consistent pressure to wounds to reduce swelling. Sleep, nutrition, and gentle movement were all considered essential for recovery. You probably won't survive if you ignore these non-herbal measures. Medieval survival demanded holistic attention to the body. By the time you lean back, touching the remaining honey in your palm, you realize folk medicine was as much about attentiveness as it was about ingredients. You're not just applying treatments, you're observing symptoms, assessing risk, and maintaining hope. Modern medicine often comes pre-packaged, but medieval strategies teach patience, observation, and creative adaptation. You probably won't survive if you dismiss these principles, but embracing them offers a quiet, tactile connection to generations who navigated illness and injury without a single pharmacy nearby. Every crushed leaf, every honey smear, every carefully applied poultice whispers lessons of resilience, resourcefulness, and human ingenuity. You pause at the edge of a hill, wind tugging at your cloak as you scan the surrounding forest. Communication in the medieval world wasn't instant. You probably won't survive if you assume news travels as fast as a text message. Villagers relied on signals, bells, smoke, and even knocks or echoes in caves to convey warnings or summon help. Historians still argue whether these methods were common practice or primarily reserved for emergencies, but their ingenuity is undeniable. You spot a stack of dried reeds beside a small fire pit. Smoke signals were a simple, low-tech way to transmit messages across distances. A single column of smoke might mean all clear, while a double puff could signify danger. Fringe tales even describe coating smoke by adding green herbs, which altered the hue or density to convey more nuanced information. Scholars debate whether these color-based codes were systematic or merely anecdotal, but it demonstrates creativity in a world without instant communication. Bells played a critical role too. Hanging from towers or simple posts, their sound could carry for miles. You probably won't survive if you ignore timing and pattern. Villagers developed rhythmic tolls to signify different events. From market openings to impending raids. Coupled with visual signals like flags or torches, these methods formed a robust, though manual, network of alerts. Knocks and echoes were even more fascinating. Some villagers developed cave messaging, using hollows or stone tunnels to carry sound across unexpected distances. You imagine tapping out a simple code on rock, listening for a faint return, and realizing that information could leap across terrain faster than a running messenger. Fringe? Definitely. Practical? In some cases, yes. Historians still debate the reliability and scope of such acoustic communication, but it underscores the adaptive thinking present in even the most constrained communities. You notice tiny details in everyday objects, a bell on a goat's collar signaling its movement, a bird-shaped whistle warning children of approaching strangers, or painted marks on trees to indicate safe paths. Each is a small, clever addition to the medieval communication toolkit. You probably won't survive if you ignore these subtle cues, because they integrate observation, pattern recognition, and timing. By the time you sit on a mossy stone and listen to the faint echoes bouncing across the hill, you realize communication wasn't just about the message, it was about attentiveness, resourcefulness, and improvisation. Smoke, bells, knocks, and coded signals create a tapestry of information, connecting villagers over distance without the luxury of modern tools. You probably won't survive if you take these innovations lightly, but by appreciating their nuance, you sense the quiet genius behind a society that could warn, guide, and protect itself using only ingenuity, observation, and a little creativity. You crouch near the edge of a muddy path, feeling the cool earth press against your palms. Waste management in the medieval world wasn't glamorous. You probably won't survive if you underestimate its importance. Villagers improvised latrines, compost pits, and drainage systems that, while rudimentary, helped prevent disease and manage sanitation. Historians still argue whether these methods were widely effective or more symbolic, but they formed a crucial layer of survival in dense settlements. You notice a simple pit latrine tucked behind a hedge, lined with straw to absorb moisture. Covering waste with earth or ash was common, reducing odor and limiting the spread of contamination. Fringe methods included adding herbs like rosemary or thyme to mask smells and purportedly repel pests. Scholars still debate whether this had any real effect on insects or was purely psychological, but it reflects the medieval fusion of practical observation and superstition. Drainage systems were basic but clever. Channels cut through streets or alongside homes guided water and waste away from living areas. You probably won't survive if you ignore stagnant pools near homes. They were breeding grounds for disease. Even in small villages, attention to slope, runoff, and placement of pits was crucial. It's a subtle engineering lesson. Understanding terrain, gravity, and natural flow could save lives. You notice composting strategies too. Human and animal waste mixed with straw or ash and left to decompose became fertilizer, enriching fields and gardens. It's practical, sustainable, and efficient, a kind of closed-loop survival system. Fringe but fascinating. Some texts suggest layering waste with crushed shells or clay, believed to purify it before application. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or experimental, but it highlights the inventive mindset of medieval villagers. Even day-to-day cleanliness mattered. Sweeping floors, replacing straw bedding, and removing spoiled food helped prevent outbreaks. You probably won't survive if you underestimate these small routines. They're not glamorous, but they're essential. Observing and managing waste, whether liquid, solid, or spoiled, is a core survival skill. by the time you stand and brush mud from your knees, the rhythm of medieval sanitation becomes clear. Waste wasn't merely unpleasant, it was information, a resource, and a hazard to be managed carefully. You probably won't survive if you neglect these principles, but following them, you sense the quiet logic, creativity, and resilience underlying everyday life. Even in filth, there was order, and in order, there was survival. You pause in a sun-dappled clearing, letting the warmth seep into your shoulders and arms. Light, heat, and the mastery of daily routines were survival tools in the medieval era. You probably won't survive if you ignore the importance of pacing and timing. Villagers synchronized tasks with daylight, seasons, and weather patterns. Historians still argue whether strict schedules were observed or if adaptation was more fluid, but daily rhythm was critical for sustaining life. You notice the gentle interplay of sun and shadow, the way morning light warms the earth and signals it's time to tend crops or fetch water. Timing was everything: planting, harvesting, cooking, even foraging followed nature's cues. Fringe practices included using water clocks or sundials to measure tasks, ensuring precise work and coordination. Scholars still debate the accuracy and prevalence of these tools, but they demonstrate a careful attention to temporal awareness. Rest and recovery were equally important. Villagers often took midday breaks, napping briefly or retreating to cooler spaces, aligning with natural circadian rhythms. You probably won't survive if you push through exhaustion. The body's limits were understood intuitively. Fringe wisdom included listening to animal behavior, birds' calls, cows' grazing patterns, or sheep returning home, as indicators of time and weather. Historians still argue how accurate or influential these cues really were, but they formed part of a comprehensive survival strategy. Nutrition and pacing intersected. Meals were timed around work, using available resources efficiently. Bread, porridge, vegetables, and preserved foods were rationed carefully, ensuring energy throughout the day. Even small rituals, stirring a pot, tending a fire, or inspecting stored goods, were part of the meditative cadence that structured daily life. You probably won't survive if you dismiss these rhythms, because consistency often dictated who thrived versus who faltered. You reflect on communal routines too. Market days, village gatherings, and seasonal festivals provided social cues, strengthened bonds, and offered practical benefits like shared labor or knowledge exchange. Fringe practices, like signaling with bells or drums to coordinate distant tasks, added layers of coordination. Scholars still debate how much structured planning versus improvisation governed these communal rhythms, but the lessons are clear: awareness of time, environment, and people shape survival. As you sink into the grass, feeling the sun fade and the wind cool your skin, you sense the interplay of all these forgotten medieval techniques. From fire starting to hygiene, clothing, navigation, and timekeeping, each skill contributes to a tapestry of resilience and attentiveness. You probably won't survive if you ignore the sum of these practices, but embracing them, you feel a pulse of rhythm, observation, and ingenuity connecting you to generations who navigated a complex, unpredictable world. It's a quiet celebration of human adaptability, and in this gentle light, you understand that survival is both art and science, woven seamlessly into everyday life. Now, as the sun dips lower and shadows stretch across your imagined medieval landscape, you allow yourself to breathe a little deeper, feeling the pulse of the day slow. The frantic rhythm of survival eases, replaced by gentle attentiveness. You probably won't survive if you ignore rest, but tonight, you can let yourself sink into the quiet reflection of all you've absorbed. Each memory of firelight flickering, water trickling through clay, or moss under your hands becomes a lullaby of ingenuity and care. The air smells faintly of smoke, herbs, and damp earth, a sensory blend that grounds you. You let the textures, sounds, and even the faint discomforts of medieval life fade into a soft rhythm. The knowledge of layered clothing, preserved foods, careful observation, and simple engineering lingers not as stress but as a testament to human creativity. You probably won't survive ignoring these lessons, but you can admire the resilience embedded in every humble village home, every worn tool, every carefully tended garden. Your mind drifts to the forest, the fields, and the village pathways, all alive with subtle signs and rhythms. Every technique, from herbal remedies to smoke signals, was a thread in the intricate tapestry of survival. Fringe ideas mingle with practical ingenuity, revealing a world both strange and logical, harsh yet remarkably resourceful. Scholars still argue about the prevalence and effectiveness of many of these practices, but tonight, the debates feel less urgent than the quiet meditation on human adaptability. As your eyelids grow heavy, you imagine yourself walking slowly through a medieval village at dusk, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the warmth of a hearth behind closed doors, and the distant call of animals settling for the night. You probably won't survive the day-to-day without attention and care, but now, in this soft twilight of thought, you can simply exist, absorbing the lessons without pressure, letting them cradle you into rest. And finally, as your breathing steadies and your mind drifts further, remember, the world of medieval survival may be gone, but its rhythm, the patient observation, the tactile engagement, the creative ingenuity, lingers as a gentle whisper. Let it ease the day away, softening the imagination and drawing you into calm, restorative sleep.